This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about something that most people in the productivity space get dangerously wrong. They tell you that building habits is about commitment, about deciding hard enough, about wanting it badly enough that the discomfort of consistency becomes worth it. And I believed that for a long time. I built entire seasons of my life on that belief. I committed harder. I decided more seriously. I wrote the goals with more conviction and more clarity than ever before. And the habits still broke. Not because I didn't care, not because I wasn't trying, but because I was missing something fundamental about how the human brain actually decides to repeat a behavior or quietly abandon it. Because here is what nobody tells you when they hand you advice about building habits. Your brain is not listening to your intentions. It is not moved by your commitment statements or your vision boards or the seriousness with which you set your alarm on Sunday night. Your brain is listening to one thing and one thing only. What happened last time? What followed the behavior? What came after? What the nervous system registered in the moments following the action you took. Because the brain is not a goal-seeking machine in the way we like to imagine. It is a consequence-tracking machine. It is continuously, unconsciously running a calculation. Did that behavior produce something worth repeating? And the answer to that question, not your intentions, not your goals, not your commitment level, is what determines whether the habit survives or disappears. A psychologist named B.F. Skinner spent the better part of his career proving exactly this, and his findings, as uncomfortable as some of them are, contain the clearest practical blueprint for making behavior stick that behavioral science has ever produced. I need to take you back to 2014. I had been working seriously for about a year on rebuilding after the collapse. I had the environment more under control. I had done some of the work I now understand through Lewin's framework. I had my implementation intentions written, the Goldwitzer structure I have talked about on this channel. I had, by most measures, built a reasonably solid foundation. And I had one habit in particular I was determined to lock in. A daily deep work block, 90 minutes every morning, no phone, no email, just the most important work, the work that was actually building the new business. Done first, before the day had a chance to pull me in every other direction. For the first 2 weeks it was genuinely good. I felt the momentum, I felt the identity shift. I was starting to believe that this time the habit would hold. And then the results stopped feeling immediate. The work I was doing in that 90-minute block was important. I knew it intellectually. But the feedback loop was long. The consequences of doing the deep work well were weeks away, sometimes months. There was no immediate signal from my nervous system that said, that was worth it. Come back tomorrow. And so slowly, without any dramatic decision, the 90-minute block started shrinking. 70 minutes, an hour, 45 minutes with a phone check halfway through, then 30 minutes of distracted half-effort that I was still technically counting as the habit. Within 6 weeks, the habit was gone in everything but name. I was frustrated enough that I went back to a mentor of mine, an older man named Thomas, who had been in business longer than I had been alive, and who had a gift for seeing the structural problem inside what looked like a personal failure. I described the whole sequence to him, the planning, the early success, the slow erosion, the collapse. He listened without interrupting, and then he asked me one question. When you finished that 90-minute block each morning, what happened immediately after? I thought about it. Nothing specific, I told him. I just moved on to the next thing. He nodded slowly and said, there's your problem. You were asking your brain to keep returning to a behavior that had no immediate reward attached to it. You were relying entirely on the long-term consequence to sustain a short-term daily action. That gap is where habits go to die. I didn't know it at the time, but Thomas was describing, in his plain, practical way, the exact mechanism that B.F. Skinner had identified and documented decades earlier. Burroughs Frederick Skinner was an American psychologist and one of the most influential behavioral scientists of the 20th century. His work at Harvard across several decades produced what became known as operant conditioning, a framework for understanding how consequences shape and sustain behavior. The core principle is this: behavior that is followed by a rewarding consequence is more likely to be repeated. Behavior that is followed by no consequence or a negative one is less likely to be repeated. Skinner called rewarding consequences reinforcers, and his research demonstrated, with extraordinary precision, that the timing, consistency, and nature of those reinforcers determines not just whether a behavior is repeated, but how deeply embedded it becomes in the organism's behavioral repertoire. Now, I know the word organism sounds cold when we are talking about your morning routine, but stay with me, because the mechanism Skinner identified in his research applies to human behavior with the same reliability it applied in his laboratory. The brain does not distinguish between a sophisticated human goal and a simpler animal drive when it comes to the fundamental calculus of consequence. If a behavior produces a rewarding signal, the behavior gets reinforced. If it doesn't, it gradually extinguishes. That is not a theory. It is one of the most replicated findings in all of behavioral science. Now, here is where it gets practically important for how you are trying to build habits in your life. Skinner identified several different schedules of reinforcement, different patterns of when and how rewards follow behavior. And his research showed that not all reinforcement schedules are equally powerful for sustaining behavior over time. The weakest schedule for long-term habit maintenance is continuous reinforcement, where every single instance of the behavior produces a reward. This sounds counterintuitive. More rewards should mean stronger habits, right? But Skinner found the opposite. When continuous reinforcement stops, when the reward is no longer delivered every time, the behavior extinguishes quickly, because the brain has been conditioned to expect a reward every single time. When the reward disappears, the signal is clear: this is no longer worth doing. The most powerful schedule for sustaining long-term behavior, the one that produces the most persistent, extinction-resistant habits, is what Skinner called variable ratio reinforcement. This is where the reward comes unpredictably, not every time, not on a fixed schedule, but randomly, at irregular intervals. This is why social media is so devastatingly effective at capturing and holding attention. Every time you open the app, you don't know if there will be something rewarding, a notification, a response, a piece of content that genuinely engages you. The reward is unpredictable, and Skinner's research shows that unpredictable rewards produce the highest rates of behavioral persistence. The brain stays engaged precisely because it cannot predict when the next reward is coming. You are not addicted to your phone because you lack willpower. You are addicted to your phone because it is running the most powerful reinforcement schedule in behavioral science on you every single day, deliberately, engineered by people who have read Skinner. Now here is the question that should hit you like cold water. The habits you are trying to build, the deep work, the exercise, the deliberate skill development, what reinforcement schedule are they running on? For most people, the honest answer is none. The reward is entirely delayed. The consequence of doing the behavior well is weeks, months, or years away. And in the absence of any immediate reinforcing signal, the brain's calculation is simple. This behavior is costly now and rewarding later. And the brain, left to its own devices, will almost always choose the behavior that is rewarding now. This is not weakness. This is neuroscience. James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, built much of his behavioral framework directly on Skinner's foundation. Clear's concept of the habit loop, cue, craving, response, reward, places the reward not at the distant end of a long-term goal, but as an immediate signal attached to every single instance of the behavior. His research synthesis shows that the cardinal error most habit builders make is attaching the reward to the outcome rather than the action. You don't reward yourself when the business succeeds. You build a small, immediate reward into the moment of executing the behavior that builds the business. This shifts the brain's calculation entirely. Instead of, this is costly now and rewarding later, the brain begins to register, this is immediately rewarding. Come back tomorrow. There is also deeply important research here from neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz at the University of Cambridge, whose work on dopamine and reward prediction identified something Skinner had observed behaviorally but could not explain neurologically. Schultz found that dopamine, the brain's primary motivation and reward chemical, is released not just when a reward is received, but in anticipation of a reward. When the brain has learned to associate a specific cue or behavior with a coming reward, it begins releasing dopamine at the cue itself, before the reward arrives. This is what we experience as motivation, as the pull toward a behavior, as the feeling of wanting to begin. What this means practically is that every time you attach an immediate reward to a habit, every time you build a reinforcement signal into the execution of the behavior, you are training your dopamine system to fire at the cue, until eventually the habit pulls you rather than you pushing yourself toward it. That is the system. That is what Skinner spent his career pointing at. That is what the people who make habits look effortless have, consciously or unconsciously, built into their daily architecture. Here is the practical work for this week. Simple, buildable, grounded in everything Skinner's research shows actually works. Pick the one habit you most need to lock in right now, the one that has broken before, the one you keep restarting. Just one. Now build a 3-layer reinforcement system around it. The first layer is immediate sensory reward. This is the signal you attach to the completion of the behavior. Something small, immediate, and genuinely pleasurable to your nervous system. Not a grand celebration, something real and sensory. A specific coffee you only drink after the deep work block is done. A 2-minute walk outside in natural light after the workout. A moment of complete stillness where you consciously register what you just executed. The key word here is immediate. Skinner's research is unambiguous. The longer the delay between behavior and reward, the weaker the reinforcement. The reward must follow the behavior as closely as possible. The second layer is a tracking signal. This sounds simple, but the behavioral research behind it is significant. Skinner's work shows that visible evidence of a behavioral streak creates its own reinforcement loop. The chain itself becomes a reward. Jerry Seinfeld famously described this as, "Don't break the chain. Mark a cross on a calendar every day you execute the behavior." The visual accumulation of crosses becomes a reinforcer independent of any other reward. You begin to feel the cost of breaking the chain before you break it. That anticipatory cost is a restraining force against the behavior of stopping, which is exactly what you need. The third layer is what I call a variable acknowledgment. Drawing directly from Skinner's variable ratio schedule, the most extinction-resistant reinforcement pattern, build occasional unpredictable moments of deeper recognition into your habit execution. Not every day, randomly. Once every week or 10 days, after completing the behavior, sit for 5 minutes and write down what executing this habit is building in your life. Not a gratitude exercise, a genuine accounting of cumulative progress. The unpredictability of when this deeper acknowledgement happens keeps the brain's engagement high in a way that a fixed weekly review never quite matches. 3 layers. Immediate reward, visible tracking, variable acknowledgement. That is a reinforcement system, not a motivation strategy, a system. I want to leave you with something that reorganized the way I understand personal accountability. For most of my adult life, I interpreted my broken habits as evidence of insufficient character. Every time a behavior I was trying to build eventually collapsed, I filed it as personal failure, as proof that I was someone who started things and didn't finish them. What Skinner's work gave me, and what I genuinely wish someone had given me 20 years earlier, was a different diagnosis entirely. The habits didn't break because I wasn't committed enough. They broke because I had built no reinforcement system to sustain them. I was asking my brain to repeat a behavior indefinitely with no immediate consequence attached. And the brain, running its ancient and entirely rational consequence tracking calculation, eventually concluded that the behavior wasn't worth the cost. That is not a character verdict. That is a design problem. And design problems have design solutions. You are not someone who can't make habits stick. You are someone who has been trying to make habits stick without the system that behavioral science has shown for decades is what actually keeps them there. Build the reinforcement. Let the system carry the behavior on the days your motivation can't. That is not a shortcut. That is how it actually works. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.